Three Baltic nations have disconnected their electricity systems from Russia's power grid.
Electricity lines with Russia and Belarus are being dismantled.
Stopped to buy any kind of energy resources from Russia, and it was our response to the war in Ukraine.
Sometimes history happens quietly, but not this time. In what can only be described as a geopolitical microphone drop, the Baltic states pressed the button and ended their decades-long dependence on Russian electricity. On a micro scale, this may seem insignificant, but if you have been following the Russia-Ukraine war closely, then take a step back. This is catastrophic for Putin, as Russia is the Baltic region's main exporter. So, what does this mean for Russia? What will change if Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin is unable to export Russian electricity to the Baltic states? For answers to all these questions and much more, the video begins. But first, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like to be informed about our content. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have officially cut off the flow of electricity between them after authorities shut down the transmission lines of the Soviet-era grid and joined the rest of Europe. This comes more than 3 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union and ends the Baltic states' last energy ties with oil and gas-rich Russia. For the 3 countries and the rest of Europe, the move had geopolitical and symbolic significance. Separated from the IPSUPS grid, which was built by the Soviet Union in the 1950s and is now operated by Russia, the Baltic states cut cross-border high-voltage transmission lines in eastern Latvia, about 100 meters from the Russian border, handing out cut pieces of wire to curious onlookers as souvenirs. The IPSUPS grid was the last remaining link to Russia for the 3 countries, which regained independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s and joined the European Union and NATO in 2004. But now this dependence is over. On February 9, 2025, they officially synchronized their power grids with Europe, closing the door on decades of vulnerability. This is not just symbolic. Until 2022, the Baltic states imported around 10% of their electricity needs from Russia. In 2020 alone, Lithuania still imported more than 40% of its electricity from Russia. Now, this dependence has been reduced to 0. The long-planned, complex and dramatic shift away from the old Soviet imperialist grid was intended to integrate the 3 Baltic states more closely into the European Union and increase the region's energy security. For Russia, this separation meant that the territory of Kaliningrad, located between Lithuania, Poland and the Baltic Sea, would be cut off from Russia's main grid, thus maintaining its electricity system on its own. Subject to last-minute tests, all 3 Baltic states will synchronize with the EU grid. The Baltic states have spent around €1.6 billion since 2018 to upgrade their grids to prepare for the transition, while Russia has spent $1 billion, including several gas-fired power plants being built in Kaliningrad. Now, the Baltic states have made a move that will almost upset all these Russian investments in electric power. This innovation, which virtually pulls the plug on Russia in the Baltics, has been welcomed by both the countries of the region and the EU group. Latvian President Edgars Rinkevics posted on his social media account that they had succeeded. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, himself Estonian, earlier this week called the change a victory for freedom and for the European Union. Lithuania's Energy Ministry has announced that it has drawn up contingency plans under which some heavy energy users, such as factories, could be temporarily disconnected from the grid in the event of blackouts to ensure basic supplies. Analysts say that in a large and synchronized region like Russia or continental Europe, ensuring a stable power supply requires a stable grid frequency, which may be easier to achieve over time, compared to what the Baltic states can do on their own. Change would certainly make a difference for the Baltics. Not being dependent on Russian electricity is one of the most important steps for the Baltics against Putin. It was already necessary for these Baltic states to take such a step, because Russia had created an important blockade in the region in terms of energy and in the Baltic Sea. To understand this better, we need to look at what happened in the region before Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania cut the last wire of the last remaining Russian power grid. As we mentioned, there was no doubt that Russia dominated this area before the change. In addition to its energy dominance, the Russians had turned the Baltic Sea into their playground. The Baltic Sea region was on high alert following the outages of power cables, telecom links, and gas pipelines between Sweden and Finland. All of these outages were believed to have been caused by ships dragging anchors on the seabed following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia denied any interference with submarine cables in the Baltic Sea, but the countries in the region agreed that the situation was caused by Russia. Therefore, the Baltic Group pushed the button against such Russian activities and put all security measures in place. Poland and the Baltic states deployed naval assets, elite police units, and helicopters after the undersea electricity link from Finland to Estonia was damaged in December, while Lithuania's army began drills to protect the land link to Poland. These measures were critical to thwart Russia's bid to dominate the energy market. Analysts argued that further damage to the links could push electricity prices in the Baltic states to levels not seen since the invasion of Ukraine. Energy prices skyrocketed during the invasion of Ukraine. There is no need for such concerns now. There is still the possibility of Russian damage to undersea cables in the Baltics. But it is clear that the Baltic states are no longer dependent on Russia for electricity. For the Baltic states, which are much more relieved that their worries and dependence on Russia for energy have largely disappeared, the inactivation of the last Soviet electricity grid is likely to pose a major problem for the Kremlin. Russia will have to face a huge economic gap when the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania leave it in terms of electrical energy. This would normally cause serious damage to Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin's war economy. The Russian economy is actually shrinking, despite GDP growth of 4.1% in 2024. This growth was largely driven by increased military spending, which contributed to a significant increase in inflation. And now, the Baltic states are hitting Russia where it hurts the most, namely in its wallet. The power exports that Russia relied on from the Baltic states are no more. Together with the EU's ban on Russian oil and its decision to cut Russian natural gas imports by 90%, this move undermines another source of income. What is worse, the Baltic states have proven that dependence on Russian energy is not a life sentence. If they can sever ties, other former Soviet states could follow. Moldova, for example, recently secured EU support to get rid of Russian gas. This is a domino effect that will further isolate Moscow. But can Putin hold Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to account? Of course, there is still a possibility that the Russian leader could cause problems for these Baltic states. Because even though these countries have severed their ties with Russian electric power, the issue of other energy sources is still unresolved. In other words, the Baltic countries have historically relied and continue to rely on Russian gas since the Soviet era. Since Russia is their primary supplier of natural gas, Russia can raise the price of natural gas in already fragile economies. Doing so could spell economic disaster for the Baltic states, which would lack the proper funds to pay for Russian gas. This leverage could put Russia in a strong position. Russia could keep the gas price high and force the Baltic economies, and then offer them some kind of economic or political deal so that the Baltic countries do not lose access to gas. Although the Baltic states have taken steps towards integration with Western Europe, their economic position leaves the door open for Russia to maintain a certain degree of power over the Baltic states. Nevertheless, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania's decision to completely free themselves from the pressure of Russian electric power is indeed commendable. It is a clear indication that the Baltics can retaliate against Russia in any way. Therefore, rather than threatening the Baltics with Russian natural gas and oil, Putin needs to solve the crisis caused by the decline in electricity exports. This is a factor that buys time for the Baltic states. Considering that Russia will no longer be able to supply electricity to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Putin needs to figure out where to direct this energy. In the meantime, the Baltic states may have a chance to find a way to get rid of other Russian energy sources altogether. Why are the former Soviet states quietly moving away from Moscow? Rumours of a silent rupture in the post-Soviet space are becoming more pronounced, with a report echoing in the Kremlin corridors. The report emphasises that states in Central Asia and the Caucasus are quietly moving away from Moscow in search of new trade corridors and closer cooperation with the West. Russia's so-called near abroad has been the Kremlin's strategic sphere of influence for years. Now, with the war in Ukraine and deepening sanctions, Russia is finding it difficult to hold on to the region. Kazakhstan is the clearest case in point. It sees Western markets as indispensable for its oil exports and its future, and has been careful to distance itself from Russia in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine. Authorities report that Kazakhstan is breaking away from Russia's gravitational pull and pursuing a multifaceted diplomacy with China and the West. Kyrgyzstan is in a different balance. Kyrgyzstan wants to maintain its economic ties with Russia, while gaining short-term benefits from acting as a middleman to circumvent sanctions. But if the West targets these trade routes, Bishkek could quickly change its position. Apart from Belarus, other former Soviet republics are also wary of Moscow. In the case of Belarus, Lukashenko does not hide his dependence on Russia, but this dependence is not a model that other countries would prefer. According to the report, Russia would like to offer these countries deeper integration with the ideal of a Eurasian bloc. But Moscow's appeal is waning as the Ukraine war drags on. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or Caucasus states seeking access to Western markets are designing new corridors, saying trade through Russia is risky now. These trans-Caspian or similar logistics networks bypass Russia and offer vast opportunities to Central Asia. The Kremlin's emphasis on common history and language is not as effective with younger generations as it used to be. An English-speaking generation is growing up, with many leaders and technocrats educated in the West. These new elites are choosing to open up to global markets over Soviet nostalgia. The report, therefore, openly admits the danger of Russia losing its traditional sphere of influence. With the exception of Belarus, almost the entire region is looking for possible alternatives to Moscow. Even in the event of any victory for Russia in Ukraine, sanctions will not be lifted immediately. This could perpetuate the independent manoeuvring of Central Asia and the Caucasus. The geography, which until recently was thought to be dependent on Russia, is now planning behind closed doors to increase its own share of profits from energy to logistics. This picture points to the Kremlin's strategic constriction. On the one hand, the search for success in Ukraine. On the other, the economic difficulties caused by the sanctions and the risk of losing Central Asia. According to the report, there is a quiet but decisive fork in the road, especially in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Some countries are opening this window of opportunity and forging deeper ties with Europe or China, taking advantage of Russia's weakness to tap into new markets. Although this rupture is not much publicised, this is exactly what is happening in reality. As a result, what remains of the old Soviet brotherhood are symbolic ties. Belarus is presented as a model for the Kremlin because of its adherence to Moscow, but other capitals are staying away from this model. The Kremlin's secret report also fails to propose a clear plan to overcome this situation. Therefore, the shock of the Ukrainian war is pushing the states that make up Russia's periphery in increasingly different directions. In the long run, this quiet and deep rupture could completely change the balance of power in Central Asia and the Caucasus. So where does Russia go from here? Putin is now forced to sell more oil and gas to Central and Southeast Asia. But the problem is that China and India are not buying at full price. They know Russia is desperate and are squeezing every ruble they can out of the deal. In 2023, China and India were paying Russia up to $35 per barrel less than global oil prices. That is a discount Moscow cannot afford. And then there is competition. China does not want Russia to dominate the energy routes in Central Asia. It wants control. China's Belt and Road Initiative has spent more than $40 billion on the region, building railroads, pipelines and infrastructure to bypass Russia altogether. The Central Asia-China gas pipeline now supplies more than 20% of China's gas imports, with further expansion planned. It is the same in Southeast Asia. Countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia have long-term energy contracts with Qatar and Australia. This leaves Russia scrambling for crumbs. And let us not forget India, which would gladly buy Russian oil, but only very cheaply. This is not a market where Russia has the upper hand. In short, Vladimir Putin has a noose around his neck in the geopolitical arena. Stay tuned for further developments. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like us.